Welcome to part 5 of our clean architecture in Flutter and Serverpod. Today we will be focusing on authentication, which, as I mentioned earlier, is usually something I would do near the start of building an app, as it's a pretty integral part of any app, assuming it's required. However, because it is a bit complex, I wanted to start with something a little more simple, which is why we did the movie list and the movie retrieve, just to get familiar with the patterns of block and clean architecture. But now we're going to dig into authentication. And we'll be building this authentication, obviously, to work specifically with Serverpod. But because we're doing clean architecture, in theory, if you wanted to change a Supabase or Firebase or a Django backend or whatever you want, the intention is you'd only have to update the data layer to do that. So let's get started here. Although authentication is more or less built into Serverpod, you do have to install some modules to do it. So this will be our first Serverpod module that we're installing. It does support signing in with Google, signing in with Apple, and just signing in with email. For the sake of time, we're just going to focus on email. But the cool thing about the authentication is it's really just a bunch of configuration to get Google and Apple to work. But it does require you, setting up stuff in, the Google Play console, or at least like the Firebase console, or your Apple developer console, which, is just a little bit tedious, but you can definitely follow the instructions if you want to do that as well. And code-wise, nothing really will need to change. Okay, so first of all, we need to add our Serverpod auth server to our pub spec inside, I believe, in the server right now. So let's go to our server project, and I'll just close these things down and go to server and find the pub spec here. And right under here, we're going to add this. And what we want to do is make sure we're using the exact same version, just so that everything's compatible. So we're not actually putting, these little guys here, these carrots, because we want to make sure we're controlling the version. Serverpod being, a fairly new technology, I don't really want it to just kind of auto update to the latest in that major release. I want to make sure I'm keeping things good. And then if a new version comes out, read the logs, check if anything would break, check if there's any migration guides, and then we can, upgrade everything. So we add this here, and we'll want to do inside the server, we'll want to do a Dart pub get, not a Flutter pub get, because this is just a Dart project. I'll cancel the VS Code one because we're already kind of doing it in parallel. Okay, so that's like the first step. Now we can add a nickname to this. So let's do that now. Let's go in config generator. So inside server, config generator.yaml. We're just going to copy this whole modules thing, and we're just going to nickname it as auth. So we don't have to refer to it as Serverpod auth. Okay, the next step here is we actually need to run the migrations here. So we're going to run our Serverpod create migration from our Serverpod folder and see what happens. Of course, make sure that Docker is running, otherwise you will get an error. I am running it. We are good. Okay, then we've already, have our Docker Compose going. We're good with that. So let's apply the migrations. So I'm just going to copy this line here. There's a role maintenance. I'm actually not sure the need for that, but let's just run it as it's kind of saying. So I'll run this. This will start the server with applying the migration. So you see it applied this migration. And if we actually look in our migrations folder, this was the one that was generated. And if we kind of look through the schema, we'll see it's like the Serverpod email auth stuff, which have things like an ID, user ID, an email, a hash, and various other things. Okay, now client setup. So this is actually the first time we're going to be touching code, or at least configuration, within our client. So we'll open up the client. So far, all we've really gone into this for is to review some of the generated code, but we're going to open the pub spec here. And we're going to copy this again in our dependencies. So this is kind of the same as a server, except it's instead of server, it's client. And we'll do the same thing where we do 1.2.6. It's important just to make sure throughout this mono repo that we're always using the same version. So I'll save that. And we'll go back a directory and into the client folder. And we'll run dart pub get. Again, not a Flutter project, so it's just dart pub get. And there we got our dependencies. Excellent. Okay, now we go to our Flutter app side. So let's go there, and let's go to Flutter. And what is it telling us to do? Well, we need to get our pub spec open. So we're doing 3 different pub specs here, and we want to make sure we have our this right here. There's 2 things we need to add. So we need to add the actual library, Serverpod auth shared Flutter. So let's just put that right here. And similarly, you get it, 1.2.6. Then we need to also make sure that our client is here, which it is, obviously, because we've been using it. Okay, so let's save all of that. And I'm just going to get our app running. So I'm going to get my iOS simulator. I'm going to also just get our server going. So we'll go into the server, and we'll just do dart bin main.dart, just to make sure it's running and ready. And I'm going to go to our main.dart within our Flutter app. And that is the wrong one. That is main.c. So we'll go here and we'll wait for it. And we'll just click run. I will just pause as this starts up, and we'll come right back. All right, the app's booted. I mostly just want to make sure that it didn't break, as in, a package issue or something, but we seem to be good right now. All right. If we go back to the docs, we will see the next thing we have to add is our session manager. And we've talked a bit about this when we were setting up our dependencies. So I'm not going to follow exactly these directions, because this is definitely not clean architecture. This is just basically a global variable in our main.dart. But let's go to our dependencies. And basically, after we do our client, we're going to also register our session manager. So to do that, we are going to raise this. We want this to be a singleton again, so we're going to do service locator dot register lazy singleton. We want it to be lazy, just because it just makes this boot up more efficient. This will only actually register when it's first called. Then in here, we want this to be of type session manager, which hopefully we will have access to. Yes, we do. And in here, it's basically kind of what we're doing here. We want to instantiate a session manager like this. So I can just grab that and paste it in. Now it's saying client not found, and that's because the client is something that's part of our dependencies. So instead of client, we will actually do service locator, and then we can actually pass in client like this. And get rid of this client and do something like that. There is a little issue here, and I think it might just because we haven't actually generated the changes here to our client. So let's make sure we do in the server directory serverpod generate. And now we're not seeing that error anymore, and we actually have this. So if I click on this, you'll actually see there's some cool generated code to do with it. So there we go. Then the next step is we actually have to await it to initialize. So that's the main reason we want this actually to be async here, is to be able to do this. Now similarly, we can't just call session manager. We will call it like this, session manager dot initialize. So now we actually have a session manager, which is great. Okay, so what I want to do, I want to do login first, because it's definitely simpler than registering. However, we're kind of a bit of a catch-22, because we can't really log in without having an account. So what I'd like to do is actually just kind of temporarily use sort of the built-in widgets and stuff that come with Serverpod for registering. Then we can just register, make our account, and then we'll do the login stuff properly with clean architecture, remove that, replace it with the proper register. That's my plan, at least. Let's see how it goes. So let's go to our movie list page. And in the app bar, I'm just going to make an action. Again, this will just be temporary. Let's just do a text button, and it can just, maybe it just says login. You'll see why that will be fine. Okay, so let's see if that shows up real nice. There it is there. Okay, so now we actually want to essentially use the built-in stuff that comes with Serverpod just to handle our auth. Let's just clean this up. And just a reminder, this is temporary. We will be removing this, so even if it looks ugly and even if it doesn't follow proper architecture, which it won't, it's just really a means to an end for us to learn about how this all works. So I actually realized instead of a text button here, there is I think it's called sign in email. Let me see. sign in with email button. So there's this package called, there's this widget called sign in with email button, but I realized we actually have to install a package to get access to this Serverpod package. So let's do that right now. And it will be something that we'll be able to remove because we don't actually want to use Serverpod's sort of basic UI because we want to have full control of auth and not just, rely on it. So let's get that installed. Our Flutter app, cd Flutter. Having some trouble today. We're going to do a Flutter pub add, and we're going to add Serverpod auth email Flutter. We'll add that, and then hopefully now we'll actually get the import for this. There it is. And we're getting an error here because I'm actually not quite sure. Because we actually have to pass something into this. What does it require? It requires the caller. So the caller is actually the auth module. So we can get that in our non-proper architecture way. We can actually just use our service locator. And actually, I'm just going to make this a new variable here. We'll just call auth equals service locator, and we'll use our. Remember if it's the session manager we want or the client. It's the client. Okay, so we want to get access to our client. And we are doing modules.auth. So that's like the caller, which, doesn't matter too much for us right now. Okay, then we have this other thing where we need void function on signed in. Oh, you know what? It's because we need to actually say caller is equal to this. There we go. No more errors. So let's save that. And let's make sure we're running our server because obviously we won't be able to log in if we're not running the server. So dart bin main.dart. And we'll just do a green arrow rebuild once this starts up. Getting some interesting errors here, or warnings. I see. All right, and I believe we're missing one thing here. So now that we have authentication, when we actually register our client, within the client constructor, we need to pass our authentication key manager, and we're going to use Flutter authentication key manager like this. Let's see if that fixes our error. There we go, it did. Okay, so I just missed that one little thing there. If I was following the auth a little more correctly, I probably would have noticed that sooner. Okay, so let's go back to our movie list page and let's put these guys back in here. And we'll just do a full rebuild again. And so we have this really ugly button here. That's fine because it's just for our purposes. So if we click this, we actually have a register account UI. And this just came with that package we installed, the Serverpod auth email Flutter package. So let's actually see if we can make this work. And I know it won't work yet, but I still want to do it just so we can kind of see what the error is. So I'll go create account. And, email already in use. That's interesting. But that could just be maybe a different error that's coming back because there's one step we missed in our setup of the server. So another file that we haven't really touched yet is inside server, which is right here. We'll go to our server.dart. And here we actually need to register that we're using auth and also make some callbacks. So let's get that set up right now. Okay, the first thing we're going to do is import our auth package. So we're just going to go import, and we're going to do package, Serverpod, and we'll look for auth in here, Serverpod, auth server, and then /module.dart. And we're going to go as auth, just to namespace it to that, so there's nothing conflicting. Then what we will do here, and we can do it before the web server, I think makes sense. So we'll just go auth.authconfig.set. And here we're going to actually construct. So we're going to pass in an authconfig. So auth.authconfig. And inside here we have to configure two things. We need something for sending a validation email, and that's when people sign up. A code is basically sent via email for them. And that takes some parameters. We have the session, we have the email, the actual email address that's being used, and a validation code, which Serverpod will automatically generate. This will be asynchronous. And here is where we can do some logic to, maybe like we check the email, maybe there's like a certain email address that like is a spam email, and we can return false to say, no, don't let this user sign up. But ultimately we want to say return true. And then we do some code here that would basically be like, to do send email to user with validation code. And that would involve, setting up something like SendGrid or Amazon SES or whatever. For our purposes, though, at least for now, we're just going to print out the code since we can view the logs of our server, and that will allow us to at least sign up. So there we go, validation code. The second thing we need to do, and we'll just do it right here, is if someone does a password reset. So that's a similar thing. We have session, we have user info instead of like just the email. So we actually have access to the user themselves, and again, a validation code. And this will be async. And we will do a similar thing where we actually just print the validation code and return true. Then let's just make sure that this gets closed and make it pretty with some trailing comments here. And there we are. So let's restart our server now. And we'll go back to our app. And we'll click this, and I'll just do something like test 1, 2, 3, test, and do a password, and we'll create our account. So now you'll see I'm getting this prompt for validation code, again, just built into the UI that was provided with us. And if I actually go to the server logs, I'll actually see this random number being printed here because we just were printing it. And I can actually just paste this in, and I will, yes, allow paste and go sign in. So Serverpod does sort of require this to almost like a two-factor authentication kind of thing, so that you can't just use a random email. You have to control that email. So now, for all intents and purposes, we are signed in from Serverpod's perspective. But we haven't really incorporated the idea of a user or anything like that into our app. So let's get that underway now. Like I said, we're going to start with login, and that's kind of why we created this really silly button here temporarily so that we can at least make an account, because it's really hard, I find, to log in when you don't have an account to log into. So let's just go to our main or our movie list page, and I'm just going to comment this out just in case we realize we want it again to do some more tests. Then we don't have to worry about it. But let's get the login stuff figured out. Okay. So we already have our auth folder made. There's just nothing in it yet. So let's get our sort of starting folders. We'll have our data folder. We'll have our domain folder. Oops, domain should be a sibling. So we'll move that. And one more folder called presentation. All right. Start by sort of designing what our repository will look like by going into the domain, making a new folder called repositories. And we're going to make a new file called auth repository.dart. So this is, again, just an abstract interface. It's not actually going to be something we instantiate. It's going to really just like define the patterns that we're trying to do. We'll call it auth repository. And I forgot the word class. So let's put that. There we go. And we're just going to start, although there's a few we're going to need in here. We're going to need stuff for registering and logging out and stuff. We're going to start just with logging in. So when we log in, we're going to expect it's a future because it's going to be asynchronous. And we are going to use our lovely fp-dart pattern to return one or two things. On the left, meaning the failure, we're going to return a failure. On the right, we are going to return a user. Now, we don't have this model yet, so we'll get to that in a moment. But let's call this login with email password, because we might eventually allow logging in with using like a single sign-on of like Google or Apple. So we'll make it very specific for this. It's not just login. And there's some parameters we're going to want. We're going to need a string of email and a string of password. Both obviously required. Okay, great. So let's actually make our user model. And we could put this in auth, but to me, auth is really more about the idea of like signing in and managing your, it's not even like necessarily your profile. It's really just like the login, the register, logging out, confirming, password resets, like it's all that kind of stuff. And to me, the user, although we could make a new feature just for user, I feel like it's such an integral part of our app that everything's going to rely on. It's really something that fits into core, in my opinion. So we're going to go into core, and we're going to make a new folder called entities. Entities are similar to models in clean architecture. The difference is they never really have any like functionality in terms of things like to JSON and from JSON and all that kind of stuff. They're really just the bare bone like const version of the model itself. So we will make that by going new file, and we'll call it user.dart. Let's just make a class called user, and it's going to have a few things. It's going to have an int of ID. It's going to have a final string of email and final string of username. Those are kind of all the things. Well, when we signed up, we made an email and a username. We didn't make an ID, but that came from Serverpod's database. Then we're going to make a const constructor on this, where we require this.id. We're going to require this.email, and we're going to require this.username. We're not going to do anything for to JSON and from JSON. That will actually happen in a different place, but this will, do the trick for us. So now we can actually import that in. Okay, so that's our auth repository. Let's just add a trailing comma here, make it a little bit prettier, and we're good there. The next thing, let's actually go into our data layer and make another new folder called repositories. So remember, this is the specific implementation of our repository when it comes to Serverpod's point of view. And like I said before, if we wanted to change to Firebase, the idea is we'd only have to modify the code in here, not this actual one right here. So we'll call this auth repository implementation, but we'll just do IMPL for short. And right in there, let us make a class that's going to inherit that. So we'll just make it a class. This won't be abstract because we will actually work with this. So we'll call it auth repository implementation, and it's going to implement our auth repository like that. And we are going to have this little error saying, hey, you're missing something. And yeah, we'll just create that override, and we'll come back to this in a moment. Now, similar to what we were doing before with other repositories, we need to make sure that our that different things get imported in here, which we'll create in a moment. But let's actually see if we can figure out the code for this. So, actually, yeah, we do need one. We do need one thing first. We need our data source, right? So let's make our data source. This will be within our data folder as well. We'll call it data sources, and we're going to make this called auth data source.dart. And we're going to first of all make our abstract interface class. We'll call it auth data source. And we're going to make our login right here. So this is going to be a future. Now this is going to always return essentially a user, but you'll see in a moment that's going to change a little bit. And we're going to call this login. And similarly, we're going to require a string, oh my gosh, a stream, no, string email, and required string password. Do that. Now, with clean architecture, we don't actually want this to return the user. We want it to return sort of our, instead of the entity, the model itself. And we're going to create a new model that essentially extends our user, but adds that sort of like additional functionality to it. So let's go and make this, and this one we will do within auth because we're going to be getting that user from our auth sort of stuff. So let's make a new folder inside data called models. So it's not an entity, it's a model because it is going to allow us to add some like to JSON and all that kind of stuff. And we'll just call it user model.dart. So we'll make a class. It'll be called user model, but it's going to extend the user. And let's make sure that gets imported. And for now, we are just going to kind of just go required. And instead of just this .id, we're using super.id. And that's because we're essentially need to pass it off to this right here. We're going to be going through and requiring it. And this is a new thing, fairly new in Dart 3. You used to have to do this where you would actually still kind of make it look like this, where you're passing in the string and email and whatever, and then you would do, super and then do it. But there's a shorthand version where we can actually just do super. So we go required super dot email and required super dot username. All right, so that's actually what we're going to return in our data source, which ultimately will get turned into a user in the domain layer. Okay, so there's our login, and in fact, maybe we should do this as login with email and password just to make it really clear. Okay, so that's just the interface for it. Now we're going to actually create the implementation, and we're going to do that just in the same file here. So we're going to make a class called auth data source implementation, and it's going to implement the auth data source that we just made. Now in here, we are going to want to create this missing override. Sure, that's great. Let's just make this a bit prettier, trailing comma. Now, similar to what we were doing before with our data source, we need to essentially pass in a dependency here. And specifically, we're going to pass in a client. We'll just call it client. But we're also going to be passing in that session manager that we've did at the start of this video. So session manager. Then, because we have these variables here, we need to do a, let's just do a auth data source, and we'll do this dot client, auth data source implementation. Oh, that didn't work. Auth data source implementation, this dot client, and this dot session manager, like that. And I believe we can make this const constructor. Yay. Okay, so now within our login code here, we'll actually write the implementation of how it's going to work with Supabase, with Serverpod. Sorry, I keep doing that. It's because I've been mentioning Supabase as like a alternative example, and it's stuck in my head. Okay, so in here, we're going to do some logic. We are basically going to talk to Serverpod. And here we can just make something called result equaling await, and we can use our client.modules.auth.email.authenticate. And authenticate requires an email and password, which luckily we have here. We do have to make this asynchronous, and everything's good. Now, because we're dealing with networking, let's make sure that something doesn't go wrong. So we're just going to do this, and we'll do catch E sort of thing. And if there is an sort of an uncaught exception, we will throw a server exception like we've been doing before. And here we can just do error.toString because that's all we really know about it. Okay, so that just handles at least the fact that something could go wrong and throw an exception, which will help us out later. Now, what we can check, this result you'll see is a authentication response. Okay, which has a few different things in it. For instance, we can check if the result.success is not true. Notice I have the negating exclamation mark there. Let's throw a server exception. And this time we know we can actually look at the result.fail reason and then convert it to a string. Now notice this could be null. So we need to have a fallback, and here we can go, not successful or something, or could not log in. Hopefully we'll have this fail reason. I believe we always will when there's not a success. It's just if there's a success, there won't be one. So the model, has that. So we'll just do that. Another thing that could go wrong is maybe we don't get user info back. So the result has something called user info on it, but it could be null in theory. So let's just handle that potential case, and we're just going to throw a server exception again that maybe says like user not found, and because we're hard coding that, we will just go like this. Okay, then assuming everything is good, we now need to tell our sort of like Serverpod client that, hey, this user's logged in, remember them, keep them in memory when they close the app and come back, like assuming it hasn't been too long, like they're still going to be there. We need to essentially register them. So now this is why we need our session manager. We can go await session manager dot register signed in user, which is kind of a strange word because it makes it seem like you're like registering them, but it's just a decision that that team made. But really we're kind of like registering it to the session, not actually register them in the database. And here we need to pass in the user info, so we can do that. And we know it's not null at this point, so that's safe to do. Then we need to essentially get a key ID and a key. Luckily, this is part of result. So we can go key ID like this, and result.key is the second parameter here. Now I'm kind of hoping these are here. This is kind of a dangerous thing to do, so we should probably also check if result.keyID equals null or result.key equals null. Let's throw another exception, because otherwise the app will crash in some way, because we'll have a null issue here. So maybe for this we can say no key or key ID found, which might just be helpful for us. Probably the end user seeing this message will not really understand. Okay, so we await that. Then what we actually want to return is our user model, right? So let's actually construct that. So let's do return user model. And we have all this stuff now because we know user info is not null. So we can actually do result.userinfo.id. And similarly, we know it's not null. Which one? We need, I guess we need it on both of these. And let's do the same thing here. I'm just going to copy this. It's kind of similar. Email, username. So we'll make this say email, and we'll make this say username. Now, similarly, I guess username is never null. It can probably be allowed to be an empty string, so we don't have to worry with that. But let's also, when we're checking for our sort of stuff here, and maybe I'll just do this right here, if result.userinfo.email equals null, we'll just say like email not found. Again, not the best error message for our end user, but at least enough for us when we're debugging this to know what the problem was. And I really don't think these things will be a problem. I think once the success is true, these will all be okay, but we need to keep our code safe. So here we are doing it. All right, now we have an auth data source. So we can go back to our implementation here, and we can actually require our, let's do auth data source. And remember, I'm not actually doing implementation because I want to keep this abstract and allow other ones to be used that inherit it. We'll call this data source. And we'll want to require this to be passed in. This data source like that, and we can probably const this as well. Okay, so now we can actually, we have this sort of throw it unimplemented error here. So let's get rid of that, and let's actually do the code for this now, because we're pretty much ready to do it. So we can just go final result is going to be equal to awaiting our data source dot login with email and password, right? Email and password, boom, 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 and we don't have to worry about putting this in a try catch because we're already handling that in the data source itself. And this, remember, will actually be a a user model. Sorry, I made a mistake. This actually could. This is where we need our try catch, because if an exception goes, something will go wrong. And we can do so. Assuming everything went right, we can actually return right our result. Right. We're going to return the user. Now, if something went wrong, here's where we would return left of that failure. But let's specifically say catch. Before the catch, we can go on server exception, because those are the only exceptions we would ever get. We're just casting it so that Dart knows that we have access to it. And we can actually return a failure of, and we want to use our e.message. Because this E right here, is actually a server exception. It's not just a regular exception, and we've designed it that way. Okay, so now this will either return one of these things or conforming to it. Everything is good. The next thing we'll make in our domain layer is our use case. So let's make a folder called use cases within domain, and let's make a file called user login .dart. Okay, so our user login use case, let's make that user login use case. And it's going to implement our use case model that we've used a bunch of times. And we need to say what the success type will be. The success will be a user, which will import. And not the fail, but the parameters we need are going to be something that we're going to make in a minute. So I'll just do this temporarily. And we're going to want our auth repository to be passed in here as a dependency. And we'll just call that auth repository, very creative. And we'll make our constructor for this, user login use case, this.auth repository. Okay, so let's actually figure out what the parameters we need are. So we're going to make a class and we'll call it user login params. And that's essentially what we'll replace this right here. And the parameters we want are, of course, a email and a password, both as strings. User login params and required this.email, required this.password. I'll fix my little typo here that I made. Save the file, and we missed a semicolon. Save the file. Okay, now what we need to do, we're getting this error here. It's saying, hey, you're not doing this override, because we need to actually override the call function here. So here, all we need to do, this will be asynchronous, as most of our use cases will generally be, and let's return awaiting our auth repository dot login with email and password. And here we'll take the params dot email and of course params dot password. And we don't have to do anything in here in terms of like checking if it was a failure or a user, because this already returns the things that we want, and we're conforming to it just fine. Let's just get rid of that, and let's actually import fp-dart and not just either. There we go. Okay, so that's our use case. Let's just take a quick step back and actually get our dependencies for all this new stuff, so we don't have to spend a whole bunch of time in this file. So we're going to make a new function, a init auth, right here. And I can do hold command and push the period key, and we can actually create a function for this, because we're not actually doing it within this class, or this isn't even a class, so it can't be a method. And in here, we're going to initialize all of our new dependencies that we've made, and the use case, and so on and so forth. So first of all, let's just do service locator dot register, this time a factory, because we're going to register our data source first. So let's just mark this as auth data source. And here we want to actually use, we can make this a little bit more shorthand. It's pretty easy. Auth data source implementation. And here we need to pass in our client and session manager. So for that, we can just use our service locator. And I mentioned this earlier before because it's a fun fact. Gedit is smart enough that we technically can just pass in the service locator like that, and it will determine and actually find the right service. However, I still do prefer to mark these just so we know really what's being passed in. And in this case, it's the client, and it is the session manager. Because if we actually look at this, those are the two things that you get passed in. So again, not actually required to do this. We can essentially do that, avoid this a lot of times if you want to make your code a little bit more, less characters. However, I just think it's good practice to do this, because when you look at this code in a couple weeks, you'll be like, what the heck am I doing here? I'm just passing in the service locator twice. All right, so now we want to register another factory. So let's just copy this. And this time we're going to do the auth repository. Auth repository, and we'll just do auth repository implementation. Let's take a look at that by importing it first. It's not liking this. Maybe there was a typo in it. Auth repository implementation. Yeah, there is a typo. So let's actually just rename this symbol here. Auth repository implementation. Save that. And now we should get the, there we are. And this actually requires just a data source to be passed in. So luckily we have that data source. So we can just go take this, pass in the data source. And then we're good for that factory. Now we need to register our use case. So let's grab this. Let's just make another space, make it look real nice. And here we're going to register the use case. So it's user login use case. And similarly, we do this. And the use case itself is requiring our repository. So we're going to grab this and pass that in. Okay, so that's our use case, and I think that's everything except for the block, which we will need to do. So let's just mark these really quickly as data source, repository, and this is our use cases. I'm doing the plural because there will be more, and then we'll just have this here for blocks. All right, and actually it will just be one block, so we'll be fine with just block. All right, and in the next video, we're actually going to set up the block and basically the whole presentation layer. So actually getting the login working from a a UI and widget point of view, and it's going to be great. And then after that, we'll be moving into registering and all the other pieces that come with authentication. So we'll see you in the next one. Thanks for sticking around.